The fluorescent lights inside Hartley's supermarket buzzed like dying wasps, casting a sickly yellow pall over the linoleum floors. It was a Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1972, and the heat outside had turned the asphalt in the parking lot into something soft and yielding, the kind of heat that made you dizzy if you stood in it too long. Inside, the air conditioning rattled and wheezed, pushing tepid air through vents clogged with decades of dust and cigarette residue. The checkout line moved with the sluggish rhythm of small-town life, 3 people deep. A farmer in overalls clutching a six-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon and a bag of salted peanuts. An elderly woman with a pocketbook the size of a small suitcase, counting out nickels and dimes for a loaf of Wonder Bread and a can of Campbell's soup. And then them. She stood with her hands folded over the handlebar of the shopping cart, her knuckles white. Her name was Caroline Winters, though most folks in Millerton County knew her as that Winters girl who married up. She wore a pale yellow sundress that had seen better days, the fabric thin enough to show the outline of her slip beneath. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and if you looked close, real close, you could see the faint discoloration along her left cheekbone, the kind that makeup couldn't quite hide in this unforgiving light. The cart held the modest haul of a week's groceries: a gallon of milk, a dozen eggs, a package of ground beef wrapped in white butcher paper, 2 cans of green beans, a loaf of bread, a jar of Skippy peanut butter. The total wouldn't break $20, but in 1972, $20 meant something. Behind her stood her husband. Richard Winters III was the kind of man who looked like he'd been assembled from a catalog of masculine affectations. Hair slicked back with enough Brill cream to grease an axle. A tailored summer suit in charcoal gray, the jacket opened to reveal a silk shirt the color of fresh cream. Gold cufflinks caught the light when he moved. On his wrist, a Rolex Submariner that cost more than most folks in Millerton made in 6 months. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine, and he wore them like a declaration of war against the scuffed work boots and sneakers that surrounded him in line. He didn't push the cart. He didn't help. He stood 3 feet back, arms crossed, examining his manicured nails with the focused intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. The cashier was a girl named Betty, 17, working the summer before her senior year at Millerton High. She wore a green apron over a white blouse and had the kind of permanent smile that came from being told to be pleasant even when you didn't feel like it. She rang up the items with mechanical efficiency, calling out the prices in a sing-song voice that had long since lost any real enthusiasm. $2.49 for the milk, 69 cents for the eggs, $1.75 for the beef. Caroline watched the numbers climb on the register's display, her jaw tight. The total came to $18.32. Betty announced it with the same cheerful tone she'd used for everything else. $18.32, Mrs. Winters. Caroline reached into her purse, a worn leather thing with a broken clasp, and pulled out a small vinyl wallet. She opened it and produced a card, one of those newfangled Bank Americard things that were supposed to make life easier. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed it over. Betty ran it through the imprinter, the machine making that distinctive ka-chunk sound as it embossed the carbon paper. She picked up the phone mounted on the wall behind the register and dialed the authorization number, the spiral cord stretching as she waited. The store's AM radio played softly in the background, Aretha Franklin demanding respect, her voice crackling through the cheap speaker. Betty's smile faltered. She glanced at Caroline, then at the phone, then back at Caroline. I'm sorry, Mrs. Winters, they're saying it's declined." The word hung in the air like smoke. Caroline's face went pale beneath the makeup. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. That can't be right. Could you try again?" Betty nodded, eager to fix the problem, and ran the card through once more. Another phone call. Another wait. The people in line behind them began to shift their weight, the universal signal of impatience. The farmer checked his watch, a Timex with a cracked crystal. The elderly woman sighed loudly enough to be heard 3 counties over. "I'm real sorry, ma'am," Betty said, her voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. "It's declined again." Caroline turned to look at her husband. Richard hadn't moved. He examined a spot on his cufflink with the absorbed fascination of a man who had all the time in the world. "Richard," Caroline said, and there was something in her voice, a note of pleading that made Betty look away in embarrassment. "Richard, do you have cash?" He looked up slowly, as if noticing her for the first time. A smile played at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile a cat gives a cornered mouse. "Ahem." "Cash," Caroline repeated, louder now, though still fighting to keep her voice steady. "Do you have cash? The card isn't working." Richard reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness. He pulled out a money clip, solid gold, because of course it was thick with bills. 20s, 50s, even a few hundreds visible in the fold. He made a show of thumbing through them, counting silently, his lips moving just enough to be noticed. "I do," he said simply. The silence that followed was the kind you could drown in. Caroline stared at him. "Well, could you? Could I what, sweetheart?" His voice was honey over broken glass, sweet and poisonous. "Could you pay for the groceries?" Richard tilted his head, as if considering a particularly difficult philosophical question. "I could. But see, Caroline, we've talked about this. You wanted to be in charge of the household budget, remember? You said you could handle it. You insisted, in fact." Her hands gripped the edge of the shopping cart. "Richard, please." "Now, I'm not saying no," he continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure everyone in line could hear. "I'm just saying that if you want me to pay for these groceries, groceries you picked out, groceries you said you'd budgeted for, then I think you should ask me properly." Betty pretended to study the register. The farmer stared at his beer. The elderly woman's mouth was a thin line of disapproval, though whether it was directed at Richard or Caroline was unclear. "I am asking," Caroline said, and her voice cracked on the last word. Richard shook his head slowly, a teacher disappointed in a slow student. "No, sweetheart, you're not asking, you're demanding. There's a difference. If you want my help, you need to ask nicely. You need to show a little gratitude, a little humility. You need to beg." The word dropped like a stone into still water. Caroline's face flushed red, then went pale again. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. Around them, the store seemed to hold its breath. Even the air conditioning stopped its rattling for a moment. "Richard," she whispered, "please don't do this." "Don't do what? I'm not doing anything. I'm standing here with plenty of money, willing to help my wife. All she has to do is ask. Properly." Betty finally found her voice, small and uncertain. Folks, if you need a minute, I can." "We don't need a minute," Richard said, not even glancing at her. His eyes stayed locked on Caroline. "My wife just needs to decide how important these groceries are to her, how much her pride is worth." That's when the voice came from behind them, low and calm as a lake before a storm. "I'll cover it." Everyone turned. The man who'd spoken stood at the end of the line, holding a bottle of Coca-Cola and a pack of Marlboro Reds. He was in his late 50s, built like a man who'd done hard work all his life and wasn't quite finished yet. He wore dark slacks and a short-sleeved white shirt with a tie loosened at the collar. On his belt, catching the fluorescent light, was a star-shaped badge. Sheriff Dale Miller, Millerton County, 4 terms and counting. Richard's expression shifted, surprise, then irritation, then something that might have been calculation. "Sheriff, this is a private matter between me and my wife." Miller set his items on the conveyor belt behind the elderly woman and walked forward, slow and deliberate. Didn't look private from where I was standing. Looked like a man humiliating his wife in front of half the town. He pulled out his wallet, worn brown leather, held together with duct tape, and extracted a $20 bill. He handed it to Betty. "This should cover Mrs. Winter's groceries, and whatever's left can go toward mine." "Sheriff, I appreciate the gesture, but," Caroline started. Miller held up a hand, gentle but firm. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm not doing this as a favor. I'm doing it because it's right. Nobody should have to beg for groceries when their husband's standing there with a money clip thick enough to choke a horse." Richard's face darkened. "You're out of line, Miller." "Am I?" The sheriff's voice stayed level, but something had changed in his eyes, something hard and ancient and utterly implacable. "Let me tell you what's out of line, Mr. Winters. What's out of line is making your wife grovel for basic necessities, while you stand there counting $100 bills like some kind of feudal lord. What's out of line is treating another human being, your wife, like she's something you own, something you can torment for your own amusement. The store had gone silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to be holding its breath. Betty stood frozen with the $20 bill in her hand, eyes wide. The farmer and the elderly woman watched like spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Richard drew himself up, trying to reclaim some dignity. "This is none of your business, Sheriff. What happens between a man and his wife becomes my business when it happens in public," Miller interrupted. "Becomes my business when I see someone being abused. And make no mistake, Mr. Winters, what you're doing here is abuse. Financial abuse, emotional abuse. You might not be laying hands on her, but you're hurting her just the same, and we both know it." Caroline's hand went to her mouth, eyes brimming with tears she could no longer hold back. Richard's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "You can't talk to me like that. My father—" "Your father's been dead for 3 years," Miller said flatly. "And even when he was alive, his money didn't buy him the right to mistreat people. It sure as hell doesn't buy you that right now." Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might take a swing. Miller didn't flinch. He just stood there, waiting, the badge on his belt catching the light like a beacon. "Go ahead," Miller said quietly. "Give me a reason, please." The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Then Richard's shoulders sagged. Not much, just enough to show he understood he'd lost this round. He reached into his pocket, pulled out that gold money clip, and peeled off 2 20s. He slapped them onto the counter next to Betty. "There, happy?" Miller picked up the bills and handed them to Caroline. "These are yours, ma'am. Your husband's paying for your groceries like he should have from the start. Betty, you can give me back my 20. He turned to Richard. "Now, Mr. Winters, you and I are going to step outside and have a conversation." "I don't have to." "Yes, you do." There was iron in Miller's voice now, the kind of authority that came from 30 years of dealing with men who thought they were above the law. "You can walk out with me voluntarily, or I can arrest you for disturbing the peace, and we can have this conversation at the station. Your choice." Richard looked around the store at Betty, at the other customers, at his wife. Whatever he saw in their faces made his decision for him. "Fine." The word came out like gravel. Miller nodded to Caroline. "Ma'am, you take your time. Get your groceries home. If you need anything at all, you call the station. Dorothy knows how to reach me." Caroline nodded, unable to speak. Miller touched the brim of an invisible hat, an old gesture from an older time, and then gestured toward the door. "After you, Mr. Winters." They walked out into the parking lot, into the brutal August heat that hit like a physical force. The asphalt was soft underfoot, and the air shimmered with waves of heat that made the distant trees look like they were underwater. Miller led Richard away from the entrance, toward a patch of shade near the shopping cart return where they wouldn't be immediately visible from inside the store. When they were alone, Miller turned to face him. "Let me be clear about something, Mr. Winters. I know men like you. I've known them all my life. Men who think money gives them the right to treat other people like property. Men who get their kicks from making someone smaller feel even smaller." "You don't know anything about me," Richard said, but there was less heat in it now, less conviction. "I know enough," Miller said. "I know that bruise on your wife's cheek didn't come from walking into a door. I know she flinches when you move too fast. I know she's scared of you, and that's exactly how you want it." Richard's face went pale, then red. "You can't prove—" "I don't need to prove anything right now. Right now, I'm just talking to you, man to man. Or rather, man to something less than a man. Because a real man doesn't terrorize his wife. A real man doesn't get his sense of worth from making someone else feel worthless." "You're lecturing me? You, a county sheriff who makes, what, $12,000 a year? You think you can tell me how to live my life?" Miller's expression didn't change. "Money's got nothing to do with character, Mr. Winters. In fact, in my experience, the more money a man has, the less character he tends to show. But let's talk about something you will understand. Power. You like power, don't you? You like having control over your wife, controlling the money, controlling her movements, controlling every little thing she does." Richard said nothing, but his jaw was clenched so tight Miller could hear his teeth grinding. "Here's the thing about power, Mr. Winters. It's relative. Right now, out here, you don't have any. Out here, that badge on my belt carries more weight than all the money in your pocket. Out here, I'm the one with the power. And I want you to understand what that feels like." Miller took a step forward. Richard took a step back. I could arrest you right now. Public disturbance. Harassment. Hell, I could probably make a case for financial abuse if I talked to the right people. I could haul you into the station, book you, put you in a cell with the drunks and the wife-beaters, which, let's be honest, is where you belong. You wouldn't dare, my lawyers. Your lawyers aren't here, Mr. Winters. It's just you and me and this parking lot. And out here in this moment, I'm the law. Miller's voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper, but somehow more terrifying for it. I'm going to give you a choice. The same kind of choice you gave your wife in that store. You can do this the easy way, or you can do it the hard way. The easy way is this. You're going to get down on your knees, right here on this hot asphalt, and you're going to apologize. To me, to God, to whoever's listening. You're going to feel what it's like to be brought low, to be humiliated, to have your pride stripped away in public. Richard's eyes widened. You can't be serious. Deadly serious. And when you're done apologizing, you're going to promise me, and more importantly, you're going to promise yourself that you'll never treat your wife like that again. That you'll open a bank account in her name, with money she can access whenever she needs it. That you'll start treating her like a human being instead of a possession. And if I refuse, then we do it the hard way. I arrest you. I make sure everyone in this county knows why. I make sure the story gets in the paper, and don't think it won't, because I know the editor of the Millerton Gazette, and he owes me a favor. I make sure everyone at your country club, everyone at your bank, everyone in your father's old social circle knows exactly what kind of man Richard Winters III really is. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the highway and the harsh cry of a crow somewhere overhead. Richard's face had gone through several colors, red, white, purple. Now it settled on a kind of ashen gray. You're insane. No, Mr. Winters, I'm just done. Done watching men like you hurt people weaker than themselves. Done pretending that money or status puts anyone above basic human decency. Miller pointed at the ground. Now get on your knees. For a long moment, Richard just stood there, trembling with rage and humiliation and the crushing realization that he'd finally met someone who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be controlled. Then, slowly, his knees began to bend. The asphalt was hot enough to burn. Richard gasped as his knees hit the surface, his expensive suit pants offering no protection from the heat. He looked up at Miller with something between hatred and pleading. Say it, Miller said. I'm sorry. Richard's mouth worked, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry. Louder and mean it. I'm sorry, the words burst out of him, raw and ragged. I'm sorry for how I treated Caroline. I'm sorry for humiliating her. I'm sorry for everything. Miller watched him for a long moment, making sure the lesson sank in. Now the promise. I promise I'll open an account for her. I promise I'll be better. Miller nodded slowly. Good, now stand up and go home, and Mr. Winters, if I ever hear of you treating your wife like that again, if I hear of you so much as raising your voice to her, I won't be this kind. There won't be a choice next time. There'll just be handcuffs and a cell and a judge who happens to be a very good friend of mine. We clear? Richard stood, his knees red and raw, his pants dusty and stained. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Good, now get out of my sight. Richard walked toward his car, a Lincoln Continental, cream-colored and pristine, moving like a man who'd aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Miller watched him go, then walked back toward the store entrance. Inside, through the glass doors, he could see Caroline at the checkout, Betty helping her bag the groceries with unusual care. When Miller walked back in, the store was still quiet, everyone pretending they hadn't been watching through the windows. Caroline looked up as he approached, her eyes red but her back straight. Sheriff, I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, ma'am, just doing my job. Your job is to make my husband. She paused, searching for the right words. Your job is to humble men in parking lots? Miller's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. My job is to protect the people of this county from those who do them harm, however that needs to happen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, plain white with black lettering. This has the station number. You call if you need anything. If he breaks that promise he just made, if he so much as looks at you wrong, you call. Day or night, you call. Caroline took the card with shaking hands. I will. Thank you, Sheriff. Miller touched his hat brim again. "Ma'am, Mr. Winters." He held Richard's gaze for a long moment, a final warning delivered in silence. Then he turned and walked back toward the store entrance, back to finish his own transaction that had been interrupted by justice. That evening, as the sun turned the western sky the color of a fresh bruise, Sheriff Dale Miller sat in his office in the Millerton County Sheriff's Department. The building was old brick, built in 1923, with holding cells in the back and a dispatcher's desk out front where Dorothy Henderson had been answering phones for 30 years. Miller's office was small and cluttered with the accumulated debris of 4 decades in law enforcement, commendations he'd never bothered to frame, photographs of men he'd served within Korea, a battered filing cabinet that held the county's secrets. He'd sent his deputy home an hour ago. The night shift wouldn't start for another 2 hours. In the quiet, he could hear the ancient building settling, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in town. On his desk sat the bottle of Coke he'd bought at Hartley's, now warm and flat. He hadn't touched it. Next to it, the pack of Marlboros, unopened. And beside that, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The photograph showed a woman, dark-haired, laughing, standing in front of a house that no longer existed. She wore a floral dress and held a baby in her arms, and if you looked closely, you could see the love in her eyes, the kind that doesn't fade even after death. Her name had been Ruth. The baby's name was Michael. They'd died in 1957, 15 years ago now, when a drunk driver crossed the center line on Route 40 and turned Miller's world inside out. The driver had been the son of the county judge, back when there was a different sheriff in Millerton County, back when certain people could get away with certain things. Miller had been a deputy then, just back from Korea, trying to build a life. After the funeral, he'd stood at their graves and made himself a promise that as long as he wore a badge in this county, no one would get away with hurting the innocent. Not the rich, not the connected, not anyone. He'd kept that promise for 15 years. He would keep it for 15 more if God gave him the time. Miller picked up the photograph, traced Ruth's face with one weathered finger, then set it back down gently. He stood, pulled on his hat, and walked out into the coming night. There were rounds to make, people to check on, a county to protect. The work was never done. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the church bells were ringing across Millerton County, Caroline Winters walked into the First Baptist Church alone. She wore a new dress, nothing fancy, just a simple cotton print she'd bought with money from her own account, and she held her head high. People noticed. In a town like Millerton, people always noticed. They noticed that Richard wasn't with her. They noticed the way she smiled at the pastor, genuine and unforced. They noticed that the bruise on her cheekbone, the one she'd tried so hard to hide with makeup, had faded completely. Some of them had heard the story or versions of it. How Sheriff Miller had confronted Richard Winters in the Hartley's parking lot. How Richard had been seen on his knees in broad daylight. The details varied with each telling, grew more elaborate, more mythical. But the core remained the same, that the sheriff had stood up for a woman who couldn't stand up for herself, and that something had changed because of it. Caroline found a seat in the middle pew, not too far forward, not too far back. As the organ began to play and the congregation rose to sing, she opened her mouth and let her voice join the chorus. For the first time in 5 years, she sang without fear, without shame, without the constant calculation of what her husband would think or say or do. She sang because she wanted to. And in the back of the church, having arrived late as he often did, Sheriff Dale Miller stood with his hat in his hands and listened. He didn't sing, never had been much for carrying a tune, but he listened, and he watched, and he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The job wasn't always about arrests or confrontations or dramatic showdowns. Sometimes it was about this, one woman finding her voice in a church on a Sunday morning. One small victory in an endless war against cruelty. It was enough. The thing about power is that it's fragile. Not the power of money or position. That kind of power is resilient, can survive almost anything. But the power of fear, the power of intimidation, the power one person holds over another through sheer force of will, that power is brittle as glass. All it takes is one person willing to say no, to draw a line, to stand between the bully and his victim. Richard Winters III learned this lesson in a grocery store parking lot in the summer of 1972. Whether he truly changed, whether the contrition he showed that day was genuine or simply the result of a greater fear, that's a question only God can answer. But he kept the account open. He stopped making Caroline beg, and on the rare occasions when Sheriff Miller's patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror, Richard drove very, very carefully. Caroline Winters learned a different lesson, that she was worth more than she'd been told. It would take time, years maybe, to fully internalize that knowledge, to rebuild a sense of self that had been systematically dismantled. But she'd taken the first step. She'd accepted help. She'd opened her own bank account and bought her own dress and walked into church alone. First steps matter. And Sheriff Miller? He learned nothing new that day, because he'd learned the important lessons long ago, in a war across the ocean and in a tragedy on a county highway. He'd learned that evil prospers when good people look away. He'd learned that sometimes the right thing requires force, requires confrontation, requires making powerful people uncomfortable. He'd learned that justice isn't always found in courtrooms or statute books. Sometimes it's found in a parking lot, under a brutal sun, in the moment when a cruel man's knees touch hot asphalt and he understands, truly understands, what it means to be powerless. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in Caroline's story, if you've been made to feel small, to beg for basic dignity, to question your own worth, know this: you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect, with kindness, with the basic human decency that should be the foundation of any relationship. There are people who can help, organizations that exist solely to provide shelter, counseling, legal assistance to those trapped in situations like Caroline's. In 1972, those resources were scarce. Today, they exist. Use them. And if you recognize yourself in Richard's story, if you've used your power to diminish another person, to make them feel worthless, to feed your own ego at the expense of their dignity, understand this: change is possible, but only if you choose it. Only if you're willing to face the ugliness in yourself and do the hard work of becoming better. The Bible tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves, to treat others as we wish to be treated. It's not just good theology. It's the foundation of a civilized society. Sheriff Miller knew this. He lived it every day of his long career, from the streets of Seoul to the highways of Millerton County. He understood that a badge doesn't just grant authority, it demands responsibility. The responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to speak for those who have been silenced, to stand between the powerful and the vulnerable and say, firmly and without compromise, not here, not in my county, not while I'm wearing this star. That's justice, that's righteousness, that's what it means to serve. The Iron Sheriff has spoken.